morning, everyone. Welcome back, and good morning to those of you joining in from the Western Hemisphere. Good afternoon to those joining in from Europe, and good evening to those joining in from East Asia. Yesterday we had 4 excellent sessions, and today we have 4 more. The first of today's sessions is a panel discussion on the future of capitalism in Asia, with Curtis Milhaupt serving as moderator. So we can maximize the time available for that panel. I'll pass the microphone on directly to Curtis. And Curtis, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Henry. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session of day 2 of GCGC. As Henry said, I'm Curtis Milhaupt of Stanford Law School. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us. We're starting the day with an extremely ambitious topic. Henry has instructed the panel to figure out the future of capitalism in Asia in the next 60 minutes. Obviously, this is a huge region, extremely diverse economically, and one with almost every conceivable type of corporate governance system and facing a wide variety of corporate governance issues. We have a really terrific panel today to bring us up to speed on what's been happening with respect to corporate governance across the region, and to give us their insights about the prospects for corporate governance reform in Asia. So really delighted to briefly introduce our panel: Hideki Kanda of Gakushuin University, Konse Kim of Seoul National University, Angela Zhang of Hong Kong University, and Yupana, Wiwattanakantang of National University of Singapore. In order to make this topic a little bit more tractable, we've decided to focus on prevailing corporate ownership structures across the region and the prospects for either their persistence or disruption. So at least in general terms, with respect to Japan, Hideki is going to talk about the future of controlling shareholders, whether they be parent companies or individuals. In Korea, Konsik will talk about the future of the chaebol business groups. In China, Angela will talk about the future of private ownership and private firms. And Yupana will tell us about the future of family ownership across Southeast Asia. We've asked each panelist to speak for about 5 minutes to get us started. We'll then have a discussion among the panelists and then open it up to audience Q&A. And I invite all the audience members to submit questions via the Q&A or chat functions. So with that, we're going to move east to west geographically across Asia, and we'll start with Hideki.
Thank you very much, Curtis, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. It's my great pleasure to be on this panel. I have just 4 points about recent trends in Japan, including some general matters and developments in corporate governance in Japan. I'm not using slides, but I'm speaking with the background of this Tokyo Metropolitan Government buildings hosting the Olympic Games, hopefully next month. The first point is rulemaking. The second point I want to talk is practice on board structure. And the third point is practicing hostile takeover attempts and defense. And finally, the fourth point, I want to say a few words on listed companies having controlling shareholders. So first on rulemaking. In Japan, rulemaking has been and is very active. The Companies Act was amended in 2019 and became effective on March 1st this year. And this reform includes requiring outside directors and revisions on director compensation, indemnification, D&O insurance, and so on. More importantly, the corporate governance code in Japan was revised just yesterday, June 11th. The code was made in 2015 by the Tokyo Stock Exchange as part of their listing rules and applies to all listed companies in the comply or explain approach. The revisions this time, meaning it was made yesterday, intended to enhance number 1, board independence, number 2, to promote diversity, number 3, to ask firms to pay attention to sustainability and ESG. Second point, Japanese practice on board structure. Under the Companies Act, listed firms in Japan have a choice among 3 board structures: 2 boards, 1 board and 1 committee, and 1 board and 3 committees. 2 board company has been the most popular structure in Japan over the past 50 years. It must have the board of directors and the board of statutory auditors, which is quite unpopular outside Japan. Toyota, for example, and 68% of the listed companies on the Tokyo Stock Exchange adopt this structure today. The Tokyo Stock Exchange white paper this year reports that 2,400 firms out of 36 firms adopt this structure. The one board, three committee company, we call it Inkai to Sechigaisha in Japanese, was introduced from April 1 of 2003 and is required to have the board of directors and three familiar committees: audit committee, compensation committee, and nomination committee. The majority of each committee members must be outside directors. For instance, Sony, Toshiba, Hitachi, and bank holding companies of three large money center banks take this structure. However, in practice, in Japan, this structure is unpopular. Only 2% or 76 firms out of 3,600 firms as listed firm Tokyo Stock Exchange are in this structure. One board, one committee structure is relatively new, was just introduced from May 1st of 2015, and must have the board of directors and the one committee, that is the supervising committee. And the majority of the supervising committee members must be outside directors. This structure has become popular in the past 6 years. Today, 30% or 1,100 firms out of 3,600 adopt this structure. You might ask why. Well, I must say that even for the firms that are not one board, three committee companies, the corporate governance code encourages setting up of the compensation committee and nomination committee by election. And indeed, most firms today do this voluntarily, so that the differences in three structures are smaller than one might think. Now, the third point on defense, takeover defense. In Japan, shareholder activism and hostile takeover attempts continue to be popular today. The most popular defense plan in Japan is a unique one indeed. It is called the Advance Warning Plan. Today, about 280 listed firms adopt this defense plan. And recently, triggering of this advance warning plan is often litigated before the court. It's like the US poison pill structure. The company attempt to issue the poison pill and people go to court. For instance, Nagoya High Court permitted triggering in Nippo Sangyo case on April 22nd this year, while the Tokyo High Court enjoined triggering this in Japan Asia Group case on April 23rd. The issue indeed is a legal issue under the Companies Act, and the courts play a very important role in this area in Japan. We were not quite sure what will happen in the future. Again, you might ask why. But I have to move to the final topic. That is, I would like to say a few words on so-called listed subsidiaries in Japan. In Japan, unlike in other Asian jurisdictions, it is rare that families or the state have the controlling stake in listed companies. But parent companies sometimes list their subsidiaries. So as of 2018, for example, the number of listed companies having a controlling shareholder is 628 out of 3,600, and that is 17%. The number of listed companies having a listed parent company is 311, that is 8.5%. In Western jurisdictions, the numbers of listed companies whose parent is also listed are in the US 0.5%, in the UK 0%, in France 2.2%, in Germany 2.1%. So in Japan, indeed, various rules have been and will be introduced by the Tokyo Stock Exchange and the Corporate Governance Code to discourage double listing or listed subsidiaries, in particular where their parent is listed as well. Well, why discourage them may be an interesting academic question. I will stop here, and thank you very much, and over back to you, Curtis.
Okay, thank you very much, Hideki. You really brought us up to speed very quickly on a lot of recent developments in Japan. We want to definitely come back and drill down into some of these. So next, I'll turn it over to Konse Kim for an update on Korea.
First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this wonderful opportunity to participate in this panel on Asia. I have prepared some slides for today, so I will proceed according to the slides. Let me start with a few words about ownership structure. As you may know, big business firms in Korea, commonly referred to as chaebol, are under the tight control of controlling minority shareholders. I found no evidence showing any significant change in this existing ownership structure. The only change that is worth mentioning here is a sudden growth of retail investors in 2020. The total number of investors in the stock market increased by almost 50% in just 1 year. But other features of ownership structure remain largely the same. Let me move on to the general political environment and recent corporate governance reforms. Since 2017, Korea has been under a reformist government that is the most pro-labor and anti-big business in our modern history. Controlling almost a 2/3 majority in the National Assembly, the ruling party is capable of passing any reform bill they want. So far, however, the current regime has been lukewarm in pushing for serious corporate governance reform. To be fair, it did bring in some changes. They include, for example, introducing multiple derivative suits, requiring a large listed firm to have at least one female director, and requiring a large listed firm to make ESG disclosure from 2025. The regime, however, shows little interest in any radical reform that may significantly undermine ultimate control of the existing controlling shareholder. I think this lenient attitude toward chaebol is partly due to their lack of confidence in an alternative corporate governance structure replacing the chaebol system. In corporate governance area, Korea's legal and regulatory environment remain largely unchanged. In our corporate community, however, we do have some significant developments. Let me briefly mention just two of them. First of all, the meteoric rise of IT and biotech firms in recent years. 3 of these new technology firms now occupy the top 10 list of the listed firms, replacing more established chaebol firms. These firms are all relatively young and still run by founding entrepreneurs. It is still too early to tell whether this new breed of controlling shareholders will behave differently than their chaebol counterparts, particularly in relation to tunneling through related party transactions, and more importantly, business succession. The second development I want to mention is the growing difficulty of leaving the family business to the next generation. The most well-known example illustrating this difficulty is the case of Mr. Lee of Samsung Group, who is now in jail for the second time. This difficulty of keeping family control is primarily due to changes in law and culture. Our inheritance tax rates are high, and our succession law is egalitarian, prescribing the equal distribution of the estate among the siblings. Culture has changed as well. Parents are now far more egalitarian in dealing with their kids, and kids are now less hesitant to go to court if they think they were discriminated against. These changed circumstances will not lead to the disintegration of chaebol overnight, but may eventually make our ownership structure more dispersed. And let me finish this short presentation with a few words about the prospect of corporate governance reform. I believe we are unlikely to have any significant reform in the near future at least. My prediction is largely due to the shrinking interest on the part of the general public, as well as the ruling elite in corporate governance matters. The decline of interest is again due to more pressing matters, such as deepening political division, COVID-19, economic inequality, and rising youth unemployment. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Konsip. Again, very succinct overview of what's been happening, and you've given us much food for thought to drill into later in the discussion. So next, on to Angela. Yesterday's session on the role of the corporation society ended with a very interesting discussion about private ownership in China and its impact. The impact of recent developments on entrepreneurship in China. And so I'll turn it over to Angela to talk to us about what's been happening in China and the prospect for private ownership in China. Angela.
Hi, thanks, Curtis. And it was a great pleasure for me to join today's session and speak with a distinguished panel of scholars. And I have also prepared some slides. So my 5-minute talk will focus on a very interesting, I actually think it's a very important development in China about state events and private retreat. And so this is actually based on a paper I'm working on with a colleague of mine, Zhang, and which we found that since 2017, there is a significant surge of equity transfer from private companies to state-owned firms. So this trend seems to be reversing a long-standing trend of that more and more state-owned firms were selling their shares to private firms, but all of a sudden, since 2017, we see this huge surge. For instance, in 2019, over 100 publicly listed private firms transfer over 5% of their equity to state-owned firms, and that lead to a worrying trend in China, because as you see recently, it appears that the government is exerting greater control over the private sector. And with all sorts of signs that you're seeing recently, like President Xi personally intervene into Ant Group's initial public offering. So Ant is the largest fintech company, and it was about to launch the biggest IPO in history, but it was the IPO was suspended just 48 hours before the launch. And there is now also an ongoing and sweeping law enforcement campaign against Chinese big tech, with companies like Alibaba, Meituan, Tencent. All of them have been subject to this massive campaign. And there have been ongoing calls on the Chinese firms, particularly not only the state-owned firms, but also the private firms, to adhere to the party's demand and to form a united front in this tough geopolitical environment. And also, and there are also more calls on installing, enhancing party buildings within private firms to have the party to play a bigger institutional role in governing private firms. So it seems like this new ownership change phenomenon is also, kind of echoing this trend of state events and private retreat. Now, what we found actually when we look closer at the data and do more analysis, what we found is actually it has less to do with the party's ideological grip on the private ownership, but more to do with some earlier reform initiatives that Xi's government promoted back during the early years of his tenure. So around 2012 to 2014, the Chinese government, particularly the financial regulator, they promulgated a series of liberalization reforms and making it easier to make acquisitions in China, and also make it easier for private firms to obtain financing. Okay, and one of this measure was the equity pledge program, which allows private firms the shareholders of private firms to pledge the stock to the securities brokerage companies. And you see here, since 2013, there is also a significant surge of private pledge in terms of, and our data shows that by the end of 2018, there are 500 public listed private firms that pledge over 90% of the shares to the securities firms. Now, and you all know in 2015, there was an epic stock market crash. And that was what I saw this as one of the major turning point in China's economic policy, because it was really since 2015, you saw this stock market crash caused the Chinese government to dial back many of the liberal economic reform initiatives. And it was since then the government started a massive deleveraging campaign, and which makes it very difficult for private firms to obtain financing. So in 2018, when there was another crash again, a lot of the private firms, particularly the large shareholders, private firms that have pledged a lot of their shares, were unable to obtain financing, and as a result, they cannot meet the margin calls. And that was the reason why a lot of these firms went bankrupt. And it was at that point the government intervened and called on the state-owned firms to bail out these private companies. And that's why we saw as this recent phenomenon of selling out private ownerships to state-owned firms. So it appears to me that this recent phenomenon of state advance and private retreat is actually seems to originate from a well-intentioned liberal market reform. But because of the pendulum swing in the Chinese government's financial policy, it actually lead to kind of unintended consequences of regressing this well-intentioned market reform. So, and that kind of refutes both the strengths and the weakness in the Chinese government's model. I mean, the Chinese government can react very quickly, can be very adaptable, but at the same time, this agility and it also becomes an inherent instability in the Chinese governance. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Angela. And we obviously want to come back to the implications of what you've just reported out to us for entrepreneurship in China. That was a topic certainly that came up yesterday as well. So thank you for that. And our last presenter, over to Yupana for update on what's happening in Southeast Asia.
Okay, so I don't know how much you know about Southeast Asia, so maybe I would like to start by introduce you some key figures so that you understand about this region. So Southeast Asia has many countries, so and with population about 600 million, and it's very diverse in many sense. A few things that I would like to highlight in terms of population. Indonesia is the largest one with 270 million. And what's interesting about it is that it's full of young people with the median age of under 30 years old. And the smallest country is Singapore, tiny with about less than 6 million people. And now if you're looking at the GDP per capita, again, interesting. Singapore is an outlier where the GDP per capita close to 60,000, and other countries is very low, like the Philippines and Vietnam, just over 3,000 US dollars. Now, in terms of stock market, the size is very small, And you could look at the number of listed firms are really under 1,000, and only 3 countries that have, market cap more than GDP. So any research, if we cover only listed firms, we only cover a really tiny part of the economy, or even, any regulation that come in and hit listed firm is only tiny, right? Another interesting point that I should highlight is about the corruption in the region. And I'm going to use this, the corruption index, the corruption perception index. Again, Singapore is ranked in the top 3 least corrupt, along with Scandinavian countries and Switzerland. And other countries, with the exception of Malaysia, rank much lower and seem to be getting worse. For example, my country, Thailand, the score has been worsening since 2015 after the military regime has been taking control over the country. Even Toyota Motors recently informed the US SEC of possible anti-bribery violations of the FCPA in Thailand. Now, in fact, if you look at the corruption level of Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, it's far worse than India, Brazil, and Colombia. And it's shocking, actually, when you look at these data. Now, if you are entrepreneurs, how would you operate in these countries with, institution problems? Yeah, smart entrepreneurs would first build political connections, right? And then you set up a lot of friends, a lot of networks. Yeah, this way you can acquire information, you can acquire favors. And then business owner would set up business groups, right? And create internal market to solve all these problems. Now, now let's look, we are trying to guess how big, how powerful these rich families are. So let's use recent Forbes estimation of the wealth of the top 50 richest. Yeah, and I think, in my opinion, the Forbes estimation is based on public information, in particular shareholdings of listed firms. So their wealth and the extent of their corporate control are likely to be underestimated. Anyway, but this gives us some sense of it. If you look at the figures, the top 50 families control their wealth related to GDP, and it is about 12% in Indonesia and Philippines, and in Malaysia it's about 16%, in Thailand 20%, and Singapore is 44%. And I think maybe Singapore represents more real figures because the country is, more transparent. It's easier to estimate the wealth, and really shocking to see that top 50 families controls about 44% of the country GDP. Okay, all right. Now, I would like to, look into this and highlight a few points here of what these people are doing. And first, on the countries, I don't have enough space, so I'm gonna put the information on Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia here. And if you look at them, most of the super rich are either old money, who inherit the money from their father or grandfather, or old founders. And the fact that these big bosses are aging also raising concern about succession problems coming up soon. Now, the second point, these families are still making money from traditional businesses. For example, agribusiness, rice, corn, rubber, palm oil, coconuts. Several became successful from gaining access to regulated industry like banking, oil and gas, coal mines, media, and telecoms. And a few of them made their money from real estate, food, and retail like 7-Eleven chain and shopping malls. Yeah, and another point, they are only very few, actually a couple of founders that are under 60. I'm trying to see whether any startup managed to become, part of the super rich. And I don't know with, I use the 60 years old cutoff because I think maybe let's consider them as young people, and you only see a couple of them. And interestingly, when you look at what, the business that they have been working and making money from, it's actually like Thailand selling energy drink. And one green energy is pretty good, and Indonesia has one on the, digital banking. Now, in summary, we have not really seen the disruption by tech startups in Southeast Asia. And the number of unicorns that come up basically came from Indonesia and a little bit from Singapore. And why is that? Maybe, you know, we saw maybe Indonesia have a huge market in terms of size, full of young folks, and they have internet access, or perhaps because people live, you know, in 17,000 islands, and Indonesia have the landscape that might, you know, offer some pain points for startups to solve. And in Singapore, clearly Temasek, the sovereign fund, stand out as a controlling shareholder in major companies. And in Vietnam, business group controlled by entrepreneurs have slowly emerged to challenge state-owned enterprises. Okay, I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Yupana. Again, a lot for us to talk about. Now, the challenge here for me as moderator is that we could spend the rest of our time on any one of these countries. But what I'd like to do is to identify some potential disruptors across the region. And of course, some of our speakers have alluded to these, but I'd like to drill down a little bit more deeply into some of them. And the first is shareholder activism. Obviously, there have been some high-profile incidents of shareholder activism. Currently, there's one ongoing in Japan, of course. Korea has also had some high-profile episodes of shareholder activism. So I'd like to ask our panelists to talk about the potential, what's been happening with shareholder activism in your country or region, and what do you see as the potential for shareholder activism, either domestic or foreign, in disrupting prevailing corporate ownership patterns and corporate governance patterns. So any of our panelists like to lead us off? Hideki, please.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to say that in Japan, ownership is pretty much diverse, generally speaking, if you compare it with other countries in Asia, or perhaps in Europe as well, so that the ownership structure in Japan remains to be somewhere in between the US, UK on one hand and other jurisdictions on the other. Having said that, in Japan, activism is very popular today, both by institutions and other shareholders. And there are a couple of reasons for that, I think, but one of the reasons is that the shareholder rights under the Companies Act in Japan are strong, and therefore certain shareholders take advantage of this to make money. They are very, sometimes very successful. For instance, a recent case of Toshiba, the activist shareholder successfully called a shareholder meeting and appointed an investigator, and the investigators just investigating a couple of things with Toshiba and just published a report 2-3 days ago. Once again, this shareholder activist purpose, I believe, is to make money by doing something on exercising shareholder rights. One more point is that those activists do not intend to take control sometimes. They just want to make profits by being active. That's the current situation in Japan, but the activism is very popular today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Konsik, maybe would you like to say a few words about the situation in Korea?
I mean, there were a couple of instances of shareholder activism even before the pandemic, but not so many. And these activists, shareholder activists, were not trying to say in any way affect the existing ownership structure. And there was one instance where interestingly, a domestic fund tries to take control of a Korean Air, and it went on for some years. But recently, the Korean bank related to the government sided with the existing controlling shareholder, so they failed. I mean, it hasn't ended the dispute, but now because of this pandemic, there is not much going on in the field of shareholder activism in Korea. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Angela, obviously the situation is quite different in China, but please share your thoughts with us.
Yeah, I mean, actually, shareholder activism is not common in China, and it's because the ownership structure is highly concentrated in Chinese publicly listed companies, and there is an enormous presence of retail investors in China. Around 2016, there were a number of notable activist campaigns. But so far, we see the Chinese institutional investors generally adopt a less confrontational and defensive approach. And also, as we just mentioned, the stock market crash in 2015 really is a milestone. And also the fact that shareholder activism, because after that, the government trying to tighten regulations and make it more difficult for some of the insurance companies to invest and make these acquisitions. And so some of the high-level executives at those activist institutional investors firm were put in jail. And then so we've seen less activities since 2017, around that time. And last year, there was one notable example of shareholder activism that when the institutional investors successfully blocked the plan of a major vaccines producer to transfer shareholding in its major subsidiaries, but that's basically it.
Okay, thank you very much. Yupana, anything of interest happening in Southeast Asia in terms of activism?
I don't have much to say because similar to what Angela talked about, ownership is concentrated, right? Using pyramidal structure to know where anybody could attack these families. Plus, they also have very strong political connection, and the government will come and help rescue them. And I don't see any interesting cases to talk. Maybe Dan can help later on.
Okay, thank you. And I see I am getting some questions in the chat and people have their hands raised. We'll turn to audience Q&A in just a minute. I see Wuchan and Jeff, and I have some questions in the chat as well. One other question I'd like to ask the panelists before we move to open Q&A, and that is, it was referenced most extensively by Yupana, but also Konsik, and that is the startup ecosystem across Asia. To what extent are new firms and new firm formation disrupting traditional firms and traditional corporate governance structures? We heard Yupana quite extensively, but I'd like to hear from the others, and in particular, also for Angela. Question is, what is the impact of what you've reported to us about increasing state control or influence over private firms on entrepreneurship? How's that affecting the environment for entrepreneurship in China? So maybe I'll start with you, Angela. Could you say a few words about that?
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese regulatory environment was very, very supportive for startups. You may recall back in 2015, the Chinese State Council promulgated this Internet Plus initiative, which strongly pushed forward innovation and entrepreneurship. And over the past 5 years, we saw the Chinese government adopted a series of favorable policy for startup. There was stimulus package for venture capitalists, startups, and generous tax rebates. And even earlier this year, the central bank, the PBOC, announced favorable financing policies for small entrepreneurs and the startup companies. And also on the capital market side, the Shanghai Stock Exchange set up a STAR board, means the Science and Technology Innovation Board, that is kind of one model after NASDAQ. And this board focused on serving innovative growth companies, and it aimed to become an attractive venue for Chinese startup companies to get listed in China. And Ant Group was supposed to be the superstar that will be listed on the star board. And that was one of the reasons that IPO was expedited, because usually it would take more than 7 months to get IPO approval, but Ant only got 2 months and got its IPO approved. But all this regulatory policies and the favorable environment seems to shift overnight since the debacle of Ant Group's IPO. And you saw from the really top leadership send out very clear signal that we should go ahead and rein in these tech companies because the oversized influence of these companies in our daily life and the possession of troves of data and I think fundamentally the whole debacle really originated from the Ant problem, and then being concerned about this kind of fintech business impact on the financial stability in China. And I do share with the government's concern. I think some of the concerns are perfectly legitimate, but the problem is this very dramatic and sudden pendulum swing, similar to what I just talked about this in the securities market. Now you see this similar dramatic reversal of regulatory environment for Chinese startups does cause huge panic among private investors, foreign investors, as well as Chinese entrepreneurs. And you saw the exit of a number of prominent Chinese entrepreneurs from the leadership role in their company, like from Pinduoduo, a Chinese e-commerce giant, and another Meituan's the ByteDance CEO Zhang Yiming also stepped down, right? I mean, so all these are not very, well, I have to fair to say this is not a very happy time for Chinese tech companies. But as to how much it will really affect entrepreneurship in China, I don't think it will fundamentally cause too much damage to the entrepreneurship, because so far the regulatory environment is still aimed at the biggest firms. So supposedly it will create, I mean, you know, if this goes well and the government's intention is all benign, this should create more room for the growth of smaller companies, because it gives them the opportunity to grow outside of the ecosystem of Alibaba and Tencent. So to some extent, this dramatic reversal do facilitate the growth of some of the entrepreneurship. We might even see more innovation in China. But at the same time, this dramatic reversal does also cause inherent instability in the system, and that do compromise investor confidence.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Hideki, could I ask you to say a few words about the startup ecosystem in Japan, both in terms of the policy and also what's actually happening on the ground?
Yeah. No, thank you very much. And indeed, the startups in Japan have been growing, and the number of IPOs have been increasing. But the speed is rather modest or slow, and it's not disruptive. On the regulatory side, sometime very soon, by the way, by the end of this month, the Financial Services Agency, which is the regulator in securities regulation in Japan, is expected to make an announcement that the securities regulation in this area will be relaxed to encourage startups, like Regulation D and the related rules in the United States. However, in my mind, this may not be the sufficient condition, and more generally, the question of equity finance in public market versus private market is or continues to be the key and puzzling question. We really need academic research in this area. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Konsik, anything that you'd like to add to what you stated earlier with respect to Korea's environment for startups?
Thank you. I mean, the government, I mean, as I've told you, government has been saying that they are not saying, but they are regarded as being anti-big business, but they are saying that they are pro startups. So they are trying to be, adopting favorable policies toward the startups. I mean, for example, they have not yet succeeded, but they have been talking about introducing this dual class voting shares for the startup companies. But I mean, the question is whether or not entrepreneurs, new breed of entrepreneurs, will act differently than the chaebol owners. It's too early to tell, and also it may be dangerous to generalize these people because they are different. I mean, they are individuals. So there is some sign that some of the controlling shareholders are not as attached as chaebol owners to share ownership, ownership control. But who knows? I mean, it's still too early to tell.
Okay, thank you. Yupana, anything further you'd like to add on this point?
Okay, would like to add a bit about Singapore. I think Singapore has a very nice ecosystem for startup, make the best in the region, and a lot of governments are supportive. Very easy to set up a company. If you go to Thailand, it will take you with tons of documentation to open up a company. It will take you a couple of weeks. You know, in Singapore, a piece of cake, right? And there's lots of VC, a lot of money. Even SoftBank, Japanese, or whoever are in Singapore. So it's very easy to raise funding. You just need to have good ideas. And then again, like what I agree with what Kong's talking about, but to rise big enough to challenge the big businesses is a long way to go.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to, I'm getting a number of questions now, so let's go to audience Q&A, roughly in the order in which I've received the questions. Let me go to Jeff, then Wuchan, and then we'll go to a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm going to ask those questioners to ask their questions live if possible. So Jeff, over to you.
Right, so this is really a question for Angela. So, I mean, the way you've explained it, in effect, there was a margin call in 2015 that the state provided a bailout. And so the question is whether the shares have gone to the SOEs because of the sale of the securities firms who found themselves undersecured when the margin call was made, whether they're sales by private shareholders, the small owners, or whether the firms themselves have sold shares to the SOEs. Because it seems to me, in answering that question, one could get at whether, in fact, the greater role of SOEs is in fact because of the government's asserting control over these firms, or in effect is a form of a bailout, as your initial story suggested. So I'm curious as to whether there's data on that.
Right. I mean, we don't have the very clear data on the because the pledge comes from the shareholders, right? I mean, so what we can observe from the data, we can only see the stock transfer from the firm to the state-owned firm, so what we also need to rely on some qualitative evidence, which are the reportings and analysis from analysts that it was the Chinese government that have been pushing, and including the Chinese state asset regulator, that have been pushing the state-owned firms to bail out these companies. And so, and that was the point where we saw this transfer. But you make a very good observation here that we need more data to support the analysis.
But let me just follow up, because if the SOEs got shares directly from the issuers, then that seems to me a little inconsistent with the story, in effect, the bailout story, the margin loan bailout story, because those are debts either by the securities firms which had lent money to the shareholders or perhaps the shareholders themselves. But there's no reason why the issuer of those shares should have been affected by the debt overhang of the securities firms or the shareholders who had borrowed money against shares which then declined in value. So isn't this rather, I guess what I'm pushing towards, doesn't your data suggest more of a government takeover story for its objectives in state direction of the economy rather than, in effect, a bailout of financially embarrassed parties within the financial system for financial stability goals?
Right. I mean, you can perfectly make that interpretation as well, because you can say the state is taking advantage of the financial trouble of these private firms. And that's why it was aggressively acquiring these private firms. And that's an excellent point that you make. We need to think about whether we have other data to try to tease out what exactly is the motivation here. But the qualitative evidence that we have suggests that, the state-owned firms are actually not interested in acquiring these companies. It was more a top-down government mandate that asked this state-owned firms to go ahead and help this troubled private firms, because the local government do not want the private firms to go bankrupt, that which will cause instability and unemployment. So it's almost like a political mandate that the state-owned firms can go ahead and help the private firms. But the other interpretation could be plausible, but we do see the state actively intervene here. It's not like the state-owned firm volunteer to go ahead and take advantage of this excellent opportunity.
Thank you. I would just say those two interpretations are not mutually exclusive. I mean, the state can have an interest both in rescuing firms and as a byproduct of that increasing state control over the firms. But in any event, we're getting lots of questions here, which is terrific. So next over to Wuchan.
Yes, I have a question regarding double listing in Japan. So this is a comment and question for Professor Kanda. In Korea, double listing is pervasive. I think there are more double listing in Korea than in Japan, the mother company being listed as well as a subsidiary company. My question is, so in case of Korea, the reason why I think there is a double listing is that the controlling family, they want to preserve their control over the group while they are expanding the company by external financing. So they need both to be listed. But my question is, I understand that there's no controlling family in big Japanese companies. So my question is, why from the very beginning, why is there double listing in Japan? Is there a reason, something different from Korea? That's my question.
Thank you very much. It's a very good question. Indeed, a couple of different types. One typical type is by M&A. Let's say a listed company purchases another listing company so that they keep that company listing for the time being, at least. On the other hand, if a listed company want to sell its part, they sometimes spins off that part into another independent or the listed company and then sell it off to another company. This is one situation, the process of M&A. Another explanation that the parent company wants to use subsidiaries, listed subsidiaries, in order to make profits for accounting purposes. And also another situation exists. By the way, however, in other countries, like in the United States, for example, keeping subsidiaries listed is a risk because you have public minority shareholders, and perhaps you are subject to litigation risk when you as a group do something, so that the double listing is usually unfavorable. And on the other hand, in Japan, there are lots of debates and discussions. We're not entirely sure, but the Tokyo Stock Exchange about 10 years ago made an announcement that they should be discouraged. And so the current legal issues, not quite responding to your central question, but the current litigation now relates to the ongoing private transactions. Because of this discouragement, certain listed subsidiaries are moving toward 100% subsidiary by cash out or going private transactions, so that people go to court on the ground that this price is unfair. People means minority public shareholders. That's what's going on. The SoftBank Yahoo group resists or rejects government policy, and they keep expanding listing subsidiaries. Indeed, they have probably 10 subsidiary listing, but that's quite unique, and they don't follow the government policy, but that's what's going on. So I guess in general, going back to your original question, there are a couple of reasons, but mainly two reasons. I think having subsidiaries listed may have some advantages for accounting purposes, maybe reputation, recruiting purposes, and more Japanese reasons, perhaps on one hand, and the process of M&A on the other. There are two main categories in Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tobias.
Yeah, thanks. Let me just come back to this activism question, because what we see here in Europe, where the ownership structures are also concentrated, you see some kind of different campaigns brought by activists, and particularly brought against companies where you have deeply entrenched families or even governments. And do you see anything of that sort in Japan? Because there's a wonderful paper by Kobe Castile for the US, surveying the landscape, where you can observe something similar. I was wondering if you see anything of that sort, that certain activists target specifically these firms with concentrated ownership structures.
Oh, thank you very much. Indeed, Japan, I mean, compared with other jurisdictions in Asia, as I said, the ownership is not quite concentrated. Therefore, it's easy for activists to do anything. The question is that in what situations do activists do? Well, I think you're quite right. That is, they usually go to the troubled firms. And my anecdote was 3 years ago, I attended a conference in Hong Kong, speaking with lots of activists, hedge funds, and other funds in Hong Kong based. And I asked this question: the Japanese companies do not show growth these days, but why are you so active in Japan? And so they answered this way: oh, you ask us a very stupid question. There is much opportunity to make money in Japan. That's why we go to Japan. So I don't know. I don't have empirical evidence. We need more empirical studies on that. But I have the impression that the activists are active for troubled firms in order to make money. That's what's happening in Japan. Thank you.
Can I add into this a little bit?
Please.
Maybe Professor Kanda, I think activists also are after the cash. Could Japanese firms, maybe similar to Korean chaebols, have a lot of cash in the balance sheet, right?
I think yes and no. Yeah, but what, I mean, usually people say yes, but when you look at statistics, the amount of cash,
it's huge.
It's not huge indeed. As a percentage matter, it does not change. It didn't change in the past 30 years. The amount of, how can I say, the bad assets, if I may say, or the assets of the poorly performed sections remain large. the probably amount of cash as a percentage matter. So probably if you talk about the actual amount of cash, and perhaps it amounts to some degree. But yes, in the sense that the activists are interested in that because that's much easier to make profit, to get money out of the target company. In that sense, the answer is yes, but no, statistically, I don't think, but this point, of course, can be debated, but it is surprisingly the cash portion as a percentage of their balance sheet in Japanese large companies, all listed companies, it has been quite stable. It's amazing. But we'll be happy to send you data if you are interested, right? Thank you.
Marco.
Yeah, thank you, Curtis. So one theme that really came through was the role of the government in Asia. I think I heard that in each case. So maybe it's a bit too long question, but let me just try and ask each one of you a question about the government. So Angela, in the case of Japan, I mean, what people in Europe, I mean, we have the G7 now taking place at this time. And we also heard yesterday that people are very concerned about the inability to actually invest in China in a meaningful way, let alone having shareholder rights. So, what do you see? What do you see in terms of this demand for reciprocity, equal rights for foreigners to invest in China, whereas Chinese companies can, of course, invest in other countries? And then for Yupana, in some sense, Singapore is a model. I mean, you showed it on your graph. So we get this capture idea that these oligarchs capture the government. But, people have said this for transition economies a long time. Once the oligarchs are very rich, they want to protect their wealth, and Singapore is a model. So is there any prospect that they'll support Singapore? And then final question for you, Hideki. So in the Toshiba case, the Japanese press reported that one of the shareholders was approached by the government, and I didn't read the Japanese original, but in case of support for the activists, the word barbecue was mentioned. So is the Japanese attitude stewardship code yes, activism no? That's the most provocative, so I've left that for you last, Hideki.
Thanks very much for your questions, and this is a point I also treasure this as an opportunity because I'm the only speaker from China. That I want to send a message to the rest of the world that China very much welcome foreign investment for a number of reasons. First, China advocate for globalization help with the Chinese economy. Second, foreign investment play a very important role as a political force for the Chinese government to lobby their own government, right? I mean, especially during the current geopolitical climate where, China has made a lot of, China has become like an enemy for a lot of countries. And so foreign investment in China is a very important stabilizing political force for the Chinese government. So what I see the government is doing is taking simultaneously a carrot and a stick approach. On the one hand, it further opened its door. It welcomed Wall Street to invest in China, open up more financial services opportunities, and including the earlier sign up of the EU-China trade deal, which supposedly make it much easier for European businesses to invest in China. So you see more carrot extending to foreign firms. You see Tesla opening the largest factory in China. So all these things, but at the same time, you also see a stick approach. China just promulgated its anti-sanction law the day before yesterday, and it's exerting pressure on foreign businesses in China to lobby their home countries to drop sanctions on Chinese companies, right? I mean, so foreign firms to some extent are held hostage by the Chinese government because Chinese government think that Chinese firms are also held hostage by the foreign governments, have been treated unfairly. In this respect, I do have optimisms for foreign investment in China.
Thank you. I just want to interject here a program note. We're rapidly running out of time. So if Hideki and Yupana could give brief answers, I'm going to try to just collect up the questions. And I would ask the panelists to take a look at the chat. We're not going to have time to get to the questions in the chat, but I think if some of you could respond directly to the questioners to answer their questions in the chat, that'd be helpful. So Hideki and Yupana, over to you. If you could be very brief with your response, we can get a couple more questions in.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much, Marco, and nice to see you again. Well, the two points. One is the Toshiba is exceptional or general is a matter of debate. Surely the Sony and Hitachi are very different from Toshiba because of the past history in the 10 years. Toshiba did accounting fraud and other things. And the governmental relationship, the government sometimes has a keen interest in national security and other reasons. They have the Foreign Exchange and Control Act, like US Patriot Act and things like this. So within that framework, the government shows interest. What happened, I'm not entirely sure, but was reported, for example, a person from the government contacted Harvard Foundation and asked them not to vote against management, and then Harvard followed it. And that was what was reported. I'm not sure what happened, but that kind of things could happen. Has nothing to do with stewardship code, I guess. Thank you.
Yupana?
I think you call them oligarchs again in Southeast Asia. And then, business group owners are powerful in Singapore.
Yupana, so I'm sorry to interrupt, Yupana. You seem to have an unstable connection. It's very hard to hear you. So with apologies, maybe you can follow up with Marco directly. I'm going to just, we're essentially out of time. Dan, you get the last word for a very, very brief question.
Thanks, Curtis. Yeah, no, just to say to Angela, fascinating presentation. My quick question is, there seems to be a lot of evidence that the Chinese government is able to wield its regulatory power over private firms and over even private institutional investors, at least domestic ones. And so my question is, what is the ultimate motivation? Is there a feeling that they're losing control, the sort of informal control? Because it seems they have a lot of control over the private firm, which makes me think, well, why are they formally trying to pull this back? Is there a sense that they're losing that informal control? So that's the question.
Very brief response to a big question, Angela. You have about 30 seconds.
Well, I don't think what's happening in China is unique to China. All over the world, the governments are trying to exert greater control over big tech. And it's just that the way and the approach that the Chinese government do this is so sudden and so dramatic that caused a huge panic among the investors and on the entrepreneurs. So and the same story with the securities market. I mean, the government clearly did not intend wasn't intending to. I don't think it was the government's intent to take control of these private firms, because private firm at the end of the day, it matters hugely for the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, because economic prosperity is fundamentally matters for the performance legitimacy of the party. So they're not going to, make all the private firms become state-owned firms. I don't think that's the intention. It's more of an inherent problem in the Chinese governance model that led to this kind of big pendulum swing in Chinese governance.